I want to look a little bit at the concentration of property. When you have Australia, let's say in the 1800s, when especially the early 1800s, there was a lot of land in Australia and not a lot of people, and so people were pretty thinly spread, and so there's a lot more land getting around than there was people, and people tended to only own as much land as they could personally use. If you're a farmer, there's an awful lot of work in chopping down the trees and putting up the fences and seeding the land and putting in waters for your horses and your cows and your sheep and so on. And so there's no point in having a really big farm if it's just going to end up being hard work for you without you not being able to actually work it. And so Australia tended to be small ownership, small private ownership, private enterprise, private ownership, and there was lots and lots of it. And you saw that not just in Australia, but it was very much the case in Japan, especially after the Second World War, the United States, up until the 20th century, really. There are a number of examples, Australia, as I mentioned. But that widespread small ownership, which is terrific for the economy, tends to concentrate over time. Now, I think probably most of you have had any interest or any experience with land, especially rural land. So people are watching this that are in regional Australia and have got a bit of an understanding of the way that farming has developed, say, over the last 50 years, will know that there are far fewer family farms today. Try saying that 5 times quickly. Than there were, let's say, 1960, 1970. The farms now are bigger, and therefore there's more concentration of ownership, a lot more employees. I guess with the technology we use on farms now, sort of giant tractors that would be unheard of in the 1950s or 1960s. So you have one man sort of sitting on a tractor, and even then it can be sort of largely guided by GPS and all sorts of clever things, and doing an awful lot of work. Probably the work of 50 or 100 men from 50 or 60 years ago. Maybe not 50 or 100 men, but certainly if you were to go back, let's say, a century, and back a century ago, we did have motorized tractors and so on. The productivity rurally is just marvelous. Increase. Has it improved everybody's standard of living? I did basically a study tour through New South Wales a few years ago, and one of the things that I discovered was that regional New South Wales, especially when you looked at small towns, I was going around New South Wales looking at mainly at towns about 5,000 people or smaller. I was going through other towns as well, but the ones I was really shining a spotlight on were these little 5,000 and less kind of populations. And they were all looking very sad. And it was largely because of the big tractors and the fact that we had better motor cars and better roads. Okay. And this ownership was tending to concentrate. I want to solve that puzzle. Okay, there's a little bit of a hint, but we'll get onto it later. You can just read that, and then I'm going to move on. Oddly enough, concentrated ownership, and I don't know if I'll have enough time to go too far into this at the moment. Maybe in a few slides, if I get through to them, I might sort of talk more about it. Concentrated ownership dampens the economy. Anyone want to suggest why that might happen?
Has it got to do with the spread of the wealth?
Would do, yep, indirectly, but more precisely. But anyway, no, I'll move on and I'll explain it to you as we go along. I thought a couple of people might have been able to twig it to it a bit more sharply. Okay,
So,
widespread
yeah.
small ownership is good for the economy. Concentrated ownership tends to dampen the economy. Okay,
Do they
why?
control the prices more?
Can do a bit. Um, yeah. A good example actually is post-war Japan. Um, yeah, it's Japan is absolutely fabulous story. Well, it's fabulous because it's just spectacular. Probably not so good for the Japanese. After the Second World War, land ownership in Japan was decentralized. It had started off as, there was sort of the Emperor of Japan, during the war. The Americans didn't like that idea very well, and so they basically took apart the virtually a feudal system that was happening in Japan. We had landlords that owned great tracts of land, had lots of tenants, right? And so after the Second World War, part of it was actually the Americans making sure the Japanese would never be a threat again, but it kind of backfired a little bit. And the reason it backfired was that the Americans went in and they said, how can we cripple the Japanese? What we'll do is we'll get rid of all of these feudal lords with their wealth, because if they're not wealthy, then they can't, be a political threat and, challenge us. And so they forced on Japan distribution of the land, which, for centuries and centuries and centuries had belonged to these feudal lords. And so you had these little tenant farmers who had been paying a bit of rent and then running their little, rice paddy or something. They said, no, no, now it's going to be yours. You don't have to worry about paying rent to sort of the Japanese lord that, you and your parents and grandparents and great parents have been paying rent to. You don't have to do that anymore. And so suddenly Japan became a country of widely distributed small proprietors. Fantastic for private industry, for private the free market. And it was. Japan post-war was an absolute economic miracle. That continued for about a generation, about 25 years. Oh, maybe a bit more, maybe 30 years. Okay. Japan was just going from strength to strength to strength. And at one stage in Australia, we were desperately scared that Japan was going to buy all of our land. Curiously, the Chinese have been doing an awful lot of that recently, well, the last generation. But we previously were afraid that Japan were going to do it because they had so much economic might. And everything they did well. And as an economy, they were going, gangbusters for a long time. But what a lot of people didn't realize was that as that was happening, land ownership in Japan was starting to concentrate. By the time I was taking serious interest in property economics, Japan was still, a bit of a miracle. In fact, I sort of came in on it just as the tide was turning for poor old Japan. And to buy an apartment, like a residential apartment in Tokyo, Japanese families were taking out 90-year mortgages. Right? They could sort of do it. They could sort of understand it. But if you need to borrow on a 90-year mortgage, you've got to have strong families, strong family values. But you're going to be borrowing what takes 3 generations at least to repay. Right? Why is that? Because land values had just skyrocketed through the roof. And between that and the economic damper that put onto the average Japanese family, and these other factors with rents kind of going through the roof, Japan now has been in a doldrum ever since the mid-80s. And they still make nice motor cars, and their manufacturing technology is still really good, but they've really plateaued out. Now, why is that? Well, a lot of economists have their different theories of it. But if you take an interest in this, I would recommend that you at least put as one of the possibilities that Japan's real estate has become so expensive that it's now basically sucking all of the economic vigor out of the country. You can see similar things happening to a certain extent, not so much with Taiwan. Actually, Taiwan handled itself an awful lot better. um, and some other countries. The global financial crisis of the mid-2000s. Why was it such a problem? Because it was closely connected with a ballooning in land values, and that comes usually with a concentration of land values, land ownership. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, Singapore. Yeah, I don't have enough time to talk about that. Singapore is a fabulously interesting example too.